My name is Leah Torrance. I'm 32 years old. And on a Thursday morning in April, I sat in a lawyer's office on the 4th floor of a building on Meridian Street and listened to a man I had never met read from a document my grandmother had signed 3 years before she died. There were 7 people in that room. My father, my mother, my brother Owen, Owen's wife, my Aunt Patricia, the lawyer whose name was Bernard Holt, and who read in the careful, measured tone of someone who had done this many times and understood that the words he was saying had different weights for different people in the room. And me. The will was straightforward in most respects. Personal belongings, distributed among family members in ways that reflected my grandmother's particular affections and long memories. A small cash bequest to her church, her jewelry to my Aunt Patricia, and the house on Calloway Road, the one she had lived in for 41 years, the one that smelled like cedar and old books, and the particular sweetness of the roses she grew along the back fence every summer. The house was to be divided equally between her 2 grandchildren. Me and Owen. Bernard Holt read those words, and then he paused in the way lawyers pause when what comes next requires its own moment. He said, "I am required to inform the beneficiaries that the property at 14 Calloway Road was transferred out of the estate prior to Mrs. Torrance's passing." I looked up from the document in front of me. "The transfer was executed 18 months ago," he said. "The property was subsequently sold. The proceeds of the sale have already been distributed." I looked at Bernard Holt. Then I looked at my father. He was looking at the table. I looked at my mother. She was looking at her hands. I looked at Owen. He met my eyes for exactly 1 second, and then looked away. I looked at my Aunt Patricia. She was the only one who looked back at me. Her expression was the expression of someone who has known something terrible was coming and has been dreading the moment of its arrival. I was the only person in that room who looked surprised. Before I tell you what was said in that lawyer's office and what I did in the weeks that followed, drop your city and the time where you are right now. I want to know where this story reaches you. Now let me take you back 4 years, to the last summer my grandmother was well, and the afternoon she sat with me on the porch of the house on Calloway Road and said something I would not understand until I was sitting in a lawyer's office, unable to look away from my father's eyes. My grandmother, Ruth Torrance, was 81 years old and had lived in the house on Calloway Road since she was 40. She had moved there with my grandfather when my father was 12 and my Aunt Patricia was 9, into a neighborhood that was still being built, with streets that didn't have names yet and yards that were raw dirt, and the particular optimism of people who are making something from nothing. My grandfather had died 20 years ago, and my grandmother had stayed, the way people stay in houses that have become more than houses, that have absorbed enough living to become a kind of record of it. The house was not grand. 3 bedrooms, a sunroom at the back that my grandfather had built himself over one long summer, a kitchen that had been updated once in the 90s and not since. The yard was the best part, deep and well tended. The roses my grandmother grew along the back fence, the particular achievement of someone who had spent 40 years learning exactly what that soil needed. People stopped on the sidewalk in June to look at those roses. She knew their names the way other people know the names of their children. I spent every summer of my childhood in that house. Not visiting, living. My parents both worked full-time, and my grandmother had retired, and the arrangement that developed when I was 7 and Owen was 10 was that we spent summers on Calloway Road while school was out. My grandmother picked us up on the last day of school every June and drove us back on the first Sunday of September, and in between those 2 dates the house on Calloway Road was ours, as much as it was hers. Owen spent those summers playing with the neighborhood kids, riding bikes, doing the things 10-year-old boys do when they have a yard and a summer and nothing particular demanded of them. I spent mine following my grandmother, into the garden in the mornings, where she taught me the names of things and when to water them and how to tell when a rose was past its bloom. Into the kitchen in the afternoons, where she cooked from memory and I wrote down what she did in a notebook I still have somewhere, the handwriting getting neater as the summers went on and I got older. On to the porch in the evenings, where she read and I read beside her, And sometimes we talked and sometimes we didn't, and the quiet between us was the comfortable kind. She was the person in my family I was most like, precise and quiet and interested in things for their own sake rather than for what they signaled about you. She noticed things. She said what she meant. She had opinions she had arrived at carefully and held without needing everyone to agree with them. My father and she had a complicated relationship in the way parents and adult children sometimes do. Love that had calcified around old disagreements into something functional but not easy. He respected her. He did not entirely understand her. She saw him clearly in the way mothers see their children clearly, without the softening of distance, and I think he knew it and found it uncomfortable. The last summer she was well was the summer before her diagnosis. She was 78, still sharp, still growing the roses, still reading on the porch in the evenings. I drove up for a long weekend in August, just me, and we fell into the old rhythms as if no time had passed. Garden in the morning, kitchen in the afternoon, porch in the evening. On the last evening, sitting in the chairs that had been on that porch since before I was born, she said something that I filed away without fully processing. She said, "I want you to know the house will be yours and Owen's equally. I've been very clear about that with Bernard, and I want you to hear it from me directly." I said I wasn't worried about it. She said, "I know you're not. I'm telling you anyway because I want you to know that I've been careful, that it's in writing and witnessed properly, and I've made sure there are no ways around it." I looked at her. "No ways around it," I said. "None." She looked out at the yard, the roses' dark shapes in the evening light. "I've been very thorough." I didn't ask what she meant by that. I thought she was being careful in the way old people are careful, making sure things were in order, ensuring nobody would have to navigate uncertainty after she was gone. I thought the "no ways around it" was a general statement about the clarity of the document. I didn't understand until the lawyer's office that she might have meant something more specific than that. My grandmother was diagnosed with early-stage dementia 14 months after that August evening. The diagnosis arrived in stages, the way these things do. A test result, then a specialist, then a name for what was happening, and a conversation about what it would mean over time. My Aunt Patricia called me when the diagnosis was confirmed. My father had known 2 weeks earlier. He had not called. I drove up to Calloway Road the weekend after Patricia's call. My grandmother was still herself that weekend. The diagnosis was early and her days were mostly intact, the lapses occasional and minor, nothing that changed the fundamental experience of being with her. We sat on the porch. We talked. I stayed 2 nights and drove back Sunday evening and called her every week after that. My father moved quickly. I understand now that this is the thing I missed while I was calling every week and making weekend visits and focusing on my grandmother's experience of what was happening. While I was doing those things, my father was making arrangements. He applied for power of attorney 6 months after the diagnosis. It was granted because he was her son and the primary family member in a position to manage her affairs, and because my grandmother, in one of her clearer weeks, signed the documents that made it official. I found this out later, in the lawyer's office, from Bernard Holt, who had prepared the POA documents at my father's request, and had noted at the time that my grandmother had seemed to understand what she was signing. Had seemed to understand. Those 3 words sat with me for a long time afterward. I didn't know about the power of attorney when it was granted. My father didn't tell me. My mother didn't tell me. Owen, who I later learned had known, didn't tell me. I spent the next 14 months calling my grandmother every week and visiting when I could and watching her slowly lose the sharpness that had always defined her, the precision of her language becoming looser, the memories less reliably available, the woman she had been receding gradually behind the disease. She died on a Wednesday in January, peacefully, in her sleep, in the house on Calloway Road, in the bedroom where she had slept for 41 years. I got the call from my father at 7 in the morning. He said, "Mom passed last night." I said, "I'll come up." He said, "There's no rush. Everything is handled." Everything is handled. I didn't understand those words either. Not until April. The weeks between my grandmother's death and the reading of the will were full of the ordinary work of grief and the logistics it generates. A funeral to arrange, a service to plan, family arriving from different directions and needing to be coordinated. The particular exhaustion of holding a loss and the administration of a loss at the same time. I handled as much of it as I could from where I was. I made calls, I helped write the obituary. I drove up for the funeral and stayed for 4 days and walked through the house on Calloway Road, with the particular sorrow of someone moving through a place they have loved that is becoming past tense in real time. The house felt different without her. Not empty exactly, but quieter in a specific way. The quiet of a space that has been inhabited by a particular person for a long time and is still absorbing her absence. I walked through the garden on my last morning before the drive home. The roses were dormant. It was February, just brown stalks and the structure of the canes she had trained so carefully. I stood at the back fence and thought about the August evening on the porch and what she had said about being thorough. I thought she had meant the will. I thought the house was waiting for what she had arranged. I came back in April for the reading. I need to stop here, because I want to tell you about the moment I walked into that lawyer's office and the room was already assembled. 7 people, as I said. And the thing I noticed, the thing that would not make sense until Bernard Holt had been speaking for 4 minutes, was the quality of the room when I walked in. There are rooms where people are waiting for something to begin, and there are rooms where people are waiting for something to be over. The difference is subtle. It lives in the posture and the eyes and the particular way people position themselves relative to each other. Rooms waiting for something to begin have a kind of forward energy. Rooms waiting for something to be over have a kind of held quality, like people who are braced. This room was braced. I noticed it, and I didn't know what to do with it, and I sat down, and Bernard Holt began reading, and I told myself I was misreading the room. That grief did this, made things feel weighted and strange. That the braced quality was just sorrow arranged differently in different bodies. I told myself that until Bernard Holt said the property at 14 Calloway Road was transferred out of the estate prior to Mrs. Torrance's passing. And then I understood what the room had been braced for. Have you ever been the last person in a room to understand something everyone else already knew? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do that now, because what happened when I asked my father to explain himself is the moment this story becomes something else entirely. The room was quiet after Bernard Holt finished speaking. The particular quiet of people who have been waiting for a thing to happen and are now on the other side of it and do not yet know what comes next. I looked at my father. He was still looking at the table. "Dad." My voice came out steady, which surprised me. "Look at me." He looked up. His expression was the expression I had seen on his face before. In other contexts, the expression of a man who has been caught doing something and has already decided that the best strategy is to explain his way through it rather than around it. "The property was transferred to me 18 months ago," he said. "Your grandmother agreed. She understood what she was signing." "She had dementia," I said. "She had early-stage dementia. She was still capable of making decisions." "Bernard," I turned to the lawyer, "was she assessed for capacity before the transfer was executed?" Bernard Holt paused. The pause of someone choosing their words carefully within the limits of their professional role. "A capacity assessment was not formally conducted at the time of the transfer." I looked back at my father. "The house was left to me and Owen equally," I said. "That's what the will says. That's what Grandma told me herself, directly, on her porch." "The will was superseded by the transfer," my father said. "The transfer was executed while she was alive. It was legal." "It was legal," I said slowly. "You used power of attorney to transfer my grandmother's house into your name while she had dementia, and then you sold it." She agreed. "To a developer." Silence. $290,000, I said. I had heard the number from Bernard Holt. "My share was $145,000. Where is it?" My father looked at the table again. "Dad, where is my $145,000? There were expenses," he said. "The medical costs over the last 2 years were significant. The estate needed..." The estate. I set my hands flat on the table. "She had medical insurance. I know because I helped her renew it 2 years ago. What expenses?" He didn't answer. I looked at Owen. Owen had not spoken since I walked into the room. He was sitting with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the middle distance, and the expression of someone who has decided the best thing to do is to not be present in any way that requires him to account for himself. "Owen," I said, "did you know?" He was quiet for a moment. "Owen." "I knew the house had been transferred," he said, not looking at me. "I didn't know about all the details." "Did you know about my share?" Another pause. "I knew there had been some redistribution," he said. "Dad explained it as settling the estate expenses." "Estate expenses," I repeated. "Leah," my mother started. "Mom." I looked at her. "Did you know?" She looked at my father. Not at me, at him, with the expression of someone who has been waiting for someone else to handle something and has just realized that the someone else is not going to handle it. "Your father felt it was the best way to manage things," she said carefully. "The best way to manage things." I looked at each of them in turn. My father, who was still studying the table. My mother, who was watching him. Owen, who was watching the middle distance. My Aunt Patricia, who was watching me with the expression of someone who has been dreading this for months. "Patricia," I said, "did you know?" "I knew the house had been sold," she said. Her voice was careful and unhappy. "I didn't know the specifics of how it was handled." "Did you know I didn't know?" A pause. "Yes," she said quietly. "I knew you didn't know." The room was very quiet. I looked at Bernard Holt. "What are my options?" I asked. Bernard Holt was precise and professional, and I was grateful for both. He explained that the transfer of the property, executed while my grandmother was alive using the power of attorney, had been legally processed and recorded. The subsequent sale had been completed and the proceeds received. From a purely documentary standpoint, the transaction had occurred. However, the power of attorney granted to my father had been for the management of my grandmother's affairs and care, not for the transfer of her primary asset to himself. The use of a POA to transfer property from the grantor to the attorney in fact, meaning from my grandmother to my father, was a use that courts scrutinized carefully, and that was, in many cases, found to exceed the authority granted. Additionally, the absence of a formal capacity assessment at the time of the transfer was relevant. My grandmother had been diagnosed with dementia. The transfer had been executed 18 months ago, 14 months after diagnosis. If her capacity could be questioned at the time of signing, the transfer could potentially be challenged. He said all of this carefully, in the tone of someone presenting information rather than advice, because giving advice was not what he was there to do. But the information was enough. I looked at my father across the table. "I'll be in touch," I said. I picked up my bag. I stood. I looked at Bernard Holt and thanked him. I looked at my Aunt Patricia and nodded. I looked at my mother and said nothing because there was nothing I wanted to say to her in that room at that moment. I looked at Owen for a long moment. He finally met my eyes. His expression was the expression of a man who has made a series of small choices that have accumulated into something large and is only now fully understanding what that something is. I did not say anything to him either. I walked to the door. My father said my name. I stopped with my hand on the doorframe, but I did not turn around. "Leah, we should talk about this as a family." I thought about that sentence, as a family. The family that had been in this room for whatever amount of time before I arrived, sitting with the knowledge of what had been done, waiting for the moment they would have to be in the room with me when I found out. "We'll talk through attorneys," I said. Then I walked out. I sat in my car in the parking garage beneath the building for 45 minutes before I drove anywhere. Not crying, not shaking, just sitting with the particular weight of having understood something that reorganized everything around it. I thought about 41 years of roses on a fence. I thought about an August evening on a porch. I thought about my grandmother's voice saying, "I've been very thorough." I thought about what she had been thorough about and whether she had known, somewhere in the clarity she still had, that there were people who would try to find a way around it anyway. I thought about the dementia, and the power of attorney, and the transfer and the sale, and the $290,000, and the moment in the room when I had asked where my $145,000 was and my father had looked at the table. I thought about Owen saying redistribution of estate expenses. I thought about my mother saying your father felt it was the best way to manage things. I thought about the room being braced when I walked in. Then I stopped thinking and started doing, which is what I do when the thinking has reached the limit of what it can produce without action. I called an attorney from the parking garage. Not Bernard Holt, who had been my grandmother's attorney and who I respected, but who was not the right person for what came next. I called a woman named Sandra Reyes, whose name I had found through 2 referrals in the time between being told there would be a reading of the will and actually attending it, because some part of me, not the part I had been listening to, had been preparing for something. Sandra Reyes answered on the second ring. I said, "I need to talk to you about a power of attorney that was used to transfer a property and what it would take to challenge it." She said, "Tell me what happened." Sandra Reyes had a small firm with 2 partners and a reputation, from the people who had referred me, for being thorough in a way that was not aggressive but was also not gentle. She was in her mid-40s with close-cropped hair and reading glasses she pushed up onto her head when she was thinking and left there, and a manner that was direct without being unkind. I met her in her office 4 days after the reading. I brought everything I had. The copy of the will Bernard Holt had provided. My grandmother's medical records from the period surrounding the transfer, which I had requested from her doctor using the patient advocate authorization she had given me years earlier when I was helping her manage appointments. A timeline I had constructed of the diagnosis, the POA, the transfer, and the sale, with dates and documentation for each. Sandra Reyes read through everything with the same focused attention I had seen from Patricia Holt 6 weeks earlier, in the different context of Dana Mercer's savings account. There was something reassuring about that attention, the feeling of being taken seriously by someone who knew what to look for. When she finished, she pushed her glasses up onto her head. "The POA language is broad," she said. "But there's a provision in your state's elder law that restricts the use of POA to transfer the grantor's primary residence to the attorney-in-fact. It's called a self-dealing restriction. Your father transferring the house to himself may have violated it." "May have," I said. "I want to review the exact language of the POA document before I give you a definitive assessment. But the absence of a capacity assessment at the time of the transfer is significant. She was 14 months post-diagnosis. The medical records show she was in what her doctor describes as moderate decline by that point." She paused. "Who else was present when she signed?" "I don't know, I wasn't there." "Your father would know, his attorney would have records." "My father hasn't been forthcoming." "I'm aware." She allowed herself a small, precise smile. "That's what discovery is for." She explained the process. A challenge to the transfer on the grounds of POA misuse and potential lack of capacity. A petition to the probate court. Discovery, which would require my father to produce all documentation related to the transfer and the sale. An accounting of the proceeds. "What are the chances?" I asked. "I don't traffic in chances," she said. "What I can tell you is that the documentation you've brought me is significantly better than most clients bring to an initial meeting, and the self-dealing restriction is clear law in this state. If the POA document contains the standard language and the transfer was executed as you've described, your father's attorney is going to have difficulty explaining why it was permissible." I sat with that. "One more thing," I said. "The proceeds. He said there were estate expenses that accounted for the redistribution. Is that something he can claim?" "He can claim it," she said. "He'll have to document it. Every dollar. Receipts, invoices, bank transfers. If the claimed expenses don't account for $145,000 in legitimate estate costs, the remainder is your inheritance." She looked at me. "How long will it take?" I asked. "Estate litigation moves slowly," she said. "A year, possibly 2, but the filing itself sends a message immediately." "File it," I said. The filing went in on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the reading. My father received notice 2 days later. He called me that Saturday. Not from a position of management this time, and not from the voice he had used in the lawyer's office when he said we should talk as a family. This was a different call, shorter, quieter, the call of someone who has received a legal document and understood what it means. "Leah." A pause. "I'd like to talk before this goes further." "Our attorneys can talk," I said. "I mean as family." "Dad," I kept my voice even. "You transferred my grandmother's house into your name while she had dementia and sold it and kept my share of the proceeds and did not tell me. The first time I heard any of it was in a lawyer's office where everyone else in the room already knew. I don't think family is the right framework anymore." Silence. "I was trying to handle things," he said. "The expenses were real. The costs of her care. Sandra Reyes will ask you to document them," I said. "Every dollar. If the costs were real, document them. This is going to destroy the family. The family was destroyed in that lawyer's office when I counted how many people already knew." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your grandmother would not have wanted this." That one I had expected. I had thought about it in advance, because I knew it was coming, because it was the thing people said when they wanted to use a dead person's imagined wishes as a reason for you to stop asking for what you were owed. "My grandmother sat on her porch and told me the house would be mine, and Owen's equally," I said, "and that she had been very thorough to make sure there were no ways around it. I think I know what she would have wanted better than you're suggesting." He hung up. I set my phone down and looked out the window at the afternoon light on the street below my apartment, and thought about roses on a fence, and the way she had known, somehow, to say what she said that August evening. She had seen it coming. She had tried to protect me. She had been very thorough. And she had still not been thorough enough. Because the thing she hadn't fully accounted for was that her son would use the document she had signed in a moment of relative clarity to do exactly what she had tried to prevent. That was the part that sat heaviest. Not what was done to me, but what had been done to her. The use of her trust, her signature, her diminished clarity, to take the thing she had spent 41 years building and tried, in her careful way, to leave where she wanted it to go. Owen called 3 weeks after the filing. I answered because I had been waiting for him to call, and because I thought what he had to say would be useful to know. He started with an apology, which I listened to without comment. It was a real apology in the way that apologies are real when the person making them has had 3 weeks to sit with what they did, and has arrived somewhere that feels like genuine regret rather than strategic damage control. I gave him credit for that. Then he said, "I want you to know I didn't know about the capacity issue. I didn't know about the self-dealing restriction. Dad told me the transfer was handled properly, and the expenses were legitimate, and I accepted that because it was easier than asking questions." "I know," I said. "That's not okay." "No." "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. "You can be honest in the discovery process," I said. "About what you knew and when, about what Dad told you, all of it." A pause. "That might make things worse for him." "Owen." I said it gently because I meant it gently. "The truth is already what it is. How you tell it doesn't change what happened. It just changes whether you're part of the honesty or part of the cover." He was quiet for a long moment. "Okay," he said finally. We didn't talk for long after that. There wasn't much more to say that didn't belong to the process that was now in motion. But the okay mattered. The same way Marcus's okay had mattered in a different story, in a coffee shop, a year before this one. Some people, when they are finally required to be honest, choose it without being forced. That matters. The legal process is ongoing. I am not going to tell you it is resolved because it isn't. What I can tell you is what Sandra Reyes told me in our last meeting 3 months after the filing, that the discovery process has produced documentation that supports the challenge, that the self-dealing restriction argument is holding up in the preliminary review, and that my father's attorney has made 2 settlement overtures that have been declined because the offers did not reflect the full amount owed. She says to give it time. I am giving it time. What I am not giving, and will not give, is the performance of normalcy. My parents have reached out twice through channels that were not the attorney, once by letter and once through my Aunt Patricia, and both times I have redirected them to Sandra Reyes. Not from cruelty, from clarity. The clarity that says this is where we are now, and this is how it has to be handled. Owen and I have spoken twice more. Short calls, careful, finding the shape of what we are to each other when the thing we thought we shared, a family, a grandmother, a house on Calloway Road, has turned out to have been different for each of us all along. He is trying. I can see him trying. I am letting him. Aunt Patricia and I had lunch last month. She told me things she had not said in the lawyer's office, things she had known and not known and suspected and been afraid to confirm. She was not part of what my father did, and she was also not entirely outside it. She occupied the uncomfortable space of someone who had information and did not use it when it might have mattered. I am not able to fully forgive that yet. I told her so. She said she understood. We had lunch anyway. Some things are repaired, some are in the process, some may not repair at all. That is the honest accounting of where things are. There is a photograph on my phone. I took it on my last morning at the house on Calloway Road, the February morning after the funeral when I stood at the back fence and looked at the dormant roses. Just a photograph of bare canes against a winter sky, brown and structured and holding the shape of the thing they would become again in spring. I look at it sometimes. I think about those roses and the 41 years of care that went into them and the woman who knew everyone by name. I think about what she was trying to give me, not just the asset, but the continuity of it, the 41-year thread of care and intention that she wanted to extend past her own life into mine. My father took the thread and cut it. Not just from me, from her, from what she had meant the house to be. That is the thing I am most angry about when I allow myself to be angry, which is not often because anger is expensive, and I need my resources for the process that is underway. But sometimes, looking at the photograph, I let myself feel it fully. And then I put the phone down and go back to the work. I want to tell you something my grandmother said the last time I visited her that made sense. Her speech had gotten harder by then, the words less reliable, the thoughts sometimes losing their shape before they arrived. We sat in the sunroom my grandfather had built, and she held my hand the way she did in the last months, the grip of someone who knows what holding means when other things are going. She said, "You know what belongs to you." I thought she was confused. I said, "Yes, Grandma, I know." She squeezed my hand. "Don't let anyone tell you different," she said, clear as anything, precise as she had ever been. I didn't know what she meant. I know now. She was thorough in the ways she could be thorough. She wrote the will and had it witnessed, and had Bernard Holt keep it safe. She told me directly on the porch that the house would be mine and Owen's equally. She held my hand in the sunroom and said, "You know what belongs to you." She did everything she could. And then she was gone. And the people who were left were the people they had always been. And what belonged to me was on a table in a lawyer's office waiting to be disputed. So I am disputing it. Not for the money, though the money is real and matters and represents years of my grandmother's life and intention. But for her. For the 41 years of roses and the sunroom and the porch and the August evening and the grip of her hand. For what she tried to give me, which was more than a house. It was a record of her care, placed in the world in the most permanent form she knew. I intend to honor it. If your family has ever treated something that was yours as something they were entitled to manage without you, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments. And if this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who needs the reminder that knowing what belongs to you is the beginning of everything. Don't let anyone tell you different. I'll see you next time.